worship. Like, worship is not the feeling that I get in worship. I think it's maybe like easier kind of to compartmentalize.
Totally.
And to be like, okay, it's like church time, it's worship time. Yeah. And then when I leave, it's work time, or it's home time, or it's hockey time, or whatever. But I think God calls us a lot higher than that. Like, you can't separate worship, I think, entirely from emotion, or else it's just dead and empty.
Yeah.
But what I think brings it back kind of to the center is like, it's always going to be your heart posture.
Sure.
Like, where is your heart actually at?
Well, welcome back to the Mezzanine Floor Podcast. I'm your host, Malachi, and this is the podcast where we talk about living in the tension between heaven and earth. So thank you for tuning in on, whatever platform you're listening on. If you're listening on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple, make sure you follow that channel so that whenever we come out with a new episode, you're notified. But I'm super excited today to welcome Jaman Heslop. He is on this side of the podcast because, as you know, usually he's directing, but we wanted to have him on today. It's so awesome to have him. And I wanted his perspective on this topic today. Jaman, you're like the head of a lot of departments in our church. It feels like you're kind of everywhere. Jaman is one of our main, he's our worship director. If you've attended KCC, you've likely seen him on stage. Seen him singing or leading. Jaman is a local of Kelowna because he's born and raised, right? Born and raised Kelowna.
Born and raised. Not literally born in this church, but born in this church.
Almost. Yeah.
And I pretty much spend my whole life here. So
yeah. So that's pretty cool. I think that's super rare. Obviously, you're how old now?
29.
29.
Yeah.
30 next year.
We're growing old together, Malachi.
Go. We are.
We're growing old.
We are growing old. You've been a part of this church for your whole life. I think that's super cool. You're going to be a dad coming up in the summertime.
Not too long away now.
Tell us how you're feeling on that.
Man, I feel like there's just periodic moments where I am super overwhelmed. And a lot of the rest of the time, it's kind of just like, you're just kind of doing the things, like getting ready.
Buying the stroller.
Yeah, you're buying the stroller. Buying the stroller was wild. Buying the stroller was insane. But it's like, but yeah, every once in a while, I'll just kind of like have a moment where I'm like, dang, I'm about to be a dad. That's crazy. But it's beautiful. It's cool. I'm really excited. It's only a couple months away now. So
yeah,
crazy.
She's due
August 24th.
Man,
it's like
crazy.
It's like 8 weeks almost.
Right
on the nose.
Yep. That's going to be amazing.
Yeah, very cool.
I know there's a few of us that are going to be dads.
We got a little tribe of dads coming up.
We're not going to be alone.
The KCC baby boom.
Yeah, literally. Baby boom. I feel like it's a church baby boom because there's so many people in my circle and kind of across Canada, even in the States, having kids. Yeah. So cool though.
Very cool.
We're starting the baby boom in our millennial generation.
Growing the church.
Yeah, literally. So I wanted to talk about something, we're going to get a little bit more serious now, but obviously, I wanted to talk about something that's kind of in your lane or very much in your lane. And I think that it's a lot of churches have a lot of different takes, a lot of different kind of flavors that they add to this, a lot of theological differences, which I think, there's something to be said about, churches that are different. It's not such a bad thing. Churches being different is not a bad thing. But it's on the topic of worship, because I think you go into a church and you're probably not going to get the same experience anywhere. It's always going to be different. It's always going to be a different feel. There's always going to be different, maybe a different value on this. Maybe some churches don't even do like a modern worship set. Maybe some churches are very traditional, but I wanted to talk about, worship in general, why worship is important. And obviously, you being, you've been a worship leader you started on a worship band. I remember in like grade 12, grade 11.
It was a little early. It was before It was probably grade 10 when I first started like playing bass on the youth band.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was like, hey, we need a bass player.
Yeah, literally.
Jaman,
I think it was before you were here. I think it was before you were here. I happened to just be, well, I don't know if you want me to tell that story. I don't have to tell that story. But
well, yeah.
I happened to be, I was, 10th grade, however old you are in 10th grade. And I was just like at youth early. And, because I had to get dropped off early. And whoever was supposed to be like playing bass that night had kind of like dipped and wasn't going to show up.
Classic youth ministry.
Yeah. And
just doesn't show up.
Yeah, that's so rough. And so I happened to just be literally like sitting there in the room. And I was Richard Bickgood actually at the time leading worship for youth.
Throwback.
It's been a minute. And he was like, hey man, like, do you know how to play guitar? And I was like, no, I don't know how to play guitar. Ironically, Richard Bickgood had given me guitar lessons that I totally failed. Like, never did.
He really meant you should know how to play guitar.
Yeah, literally. I just never did the work at home on my own. It was rough. Anyway, he was like, oh, do you know how to play bass or anything? And I was like, no, but no, I don't. And he was like, well, do you want to like just try? And I was like, okay. So, I mean, it's worship music, especially like early 2000s worship music.
Sure.
It's like every song is 4 chords, 6 if it's complicated.
Yeah.
And so literally he showed me the notes on the neck that I needed to know for the songs that night. And I played, and it wasn't great. But I played that night, and then I just like became the youth bass player.
And it obviously wasn't bad enough for them not to ask you back. So.
I mean, I guess, but it's also
it's youth ministry.
Yeah.
It's youth ministry. If you've been in youth ministry, you know. So that was kind of like your starting, obviously your first step into worship ministry. But I would love to ask maybe not what like drew you there, but maybe what kept you really like, because I feel like that's been a big part of your journey is like you've been very into, you've been doing worship ministry for a long time. You stayed doing worship ministry, and now it's, literally a big part of what you do as, your ministry and as well as work. So maybe that's a broad question, but like kind of what drew you into that? Maybe a little bit of like your story of, maybe a bit of your journey into that and what kept you there.
Yeah. I mean, as far as like playing on a band, I never really had like sights or like intentions to do that, to be honest, really like ever.
Yeah.
Family's like not very musical. I feel like I have an ear, but I'm not like, I didn't grow up in a family where, people played guitar and piano and stuff. It was just very like sports and which I also love. But, so I never really grew up that way. I actually felt like as like kind of like a young man coming, like, I don't know, being around youth ministry and stuff, I actually always felt more called to youth ministry. I never really made that about like, well, that means I have to be a youth pastor or whatever. Sure. But I always kind of felt like that was where I should be, like I felt led to be serving, I guess. And so to me, I didn't even really see that kind of first step as like, I'm going to be a worship guy or whatever that even means. I was just like on the youth team. Like I was a youth leader on the youth team. And that day I happened to like get thrown into a spot. And that's kind of how I tried to be about it. Cause I was always really nervous about pushing my thing. Yeah, like I felt like I wanted to be in youth ministry, but I felt like if I just like took it my own direction in any way, that I would be like wrecking it, or like maybe that's not what God wants kind of thing. As you do when you're like 14, 15, 16, you're just overthinking.
Your identity becomes that.
Well, everything you...
I am the youth ministry bass player.
Well, I feel like kids back then too, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it probably is like that now, but maybe not to the same degree. I felt so much pressure as a kid to like do what God would have me do. Like what's God's purpose for my life kind of thing. And so I always felt like, I do feel called to be on the youth team and to help, but like I'll help however you want. Like I wasn't trying to push my way anywhere or like I need to be a youth pastor or whatever. So I mean, I never really looked at it like that in the first place, but I will say like I did always like I would say my main kind of place where I connected with God growing up was always through worship. Like I always kind of felt like I don't know if this is a weird way to say it, but I always felt like I kind of had an easy time, like feeling his presence in worship. Like, I have really early memories in like, elementary school at a camp where like I just got rocked by like the presence, and it was like everyone in the room was, to be like, not just I wasn't special or anything, but it was like, that was always kind of like the way that God, I feel like, kind of connected with me.
Yeah.
So I've always been like a worshiper in that way. I don't know. I don't even really like saying it because it feels like that cliche thing. And I believe like everybody is genuinely. People maybe are more inclined to it than others, or whatever.
You'd have more of a natural propensity to be connected that way. That's how you.
It was really
interact.
Honestly, my relationship with God back then was literally pretty much feeling His Spirit in worship. So it was really like an inch deep,
sure,
and kind of a mile wide, and it was very. I mean, as a young kid, often probably a lot of kids it's pretty up and down, and it's pretty like. Tumbleweedy, you get pushed around by the things that come up. But that was always like where I connected with God, where I kind of felt Him, and where I felt like, okay, this is like really real. And so I'd say that's kind of how it was.
And obviously, like that, I wouldn't say that's like maybe it's like a driver for you to stay in it. And obviously, like you were saying, like this is kind of this is my philosophy. Like I'm going to be used by God and God, wherever you're going to take me. And obviously that's brought you to today. Like, you want to share a little bit about like what drew you to like actually becoming, obviously like the job opening is there, but like, that's a big part of it. Like, hey, is there an opportunity here? But like, cause you were in Rhode Island for a bit, like doing like school. Yeah. Did you feel like, you shared a little bit with me, but like, how did you get from Rhode Island back to Kelowna?
Even a little bit like a little bit before like ministry school and stuff, I always kind of like looking back, I always kind of felt like I could see like there was this point where I felt like a little bit of like kind of like a transition where I felt like, not called to youth. I still have a heart for youth kids like today.
Sure.
I'm not even really involved with youth ministry, but I'm around. I try to be intentional with them and on and on. But it kind of felt like God used youth ministry to kind of lead me to where I got with worship in an interesting way. Like I remember the kind of like looking back now, I feel like I can see it pretty clearly, but there was kind of this point where like, oh, maybe, I was leading upstairs a little bit and kind of started to feel more like, oh, maybe this is kind of where God has me going. Got to the point where I was like, maybe because I was leading from bass at first.
Yeah.
And which is wild. It's so much harder to lead from bass. But eventually like taught myself to play guitar just so that it would be like it's just easier to lead a band from guitar than it is from bass. Yeah. And ended up kind of in that season where I was kind of starting to recognize, I guess, that transition, like, hey, maybe I should like sow into these gifts and like look into some places to go to where, like a ministry school type of thing where I can go and I can kind of like sow into these because it felt like that's where God was leading me. So I ended up going to Rhode Island on the East Coast, which I had rarely probably heard of or knew existed prior. Shout out Awakening Church in Rhode Island. Yeah. Awesome place. Church. Awesome place. Honestly, like ton of awesome connections there still, like really great leadership, really awesome, like beautiful time for me where I just like grew leaps and bounds, stretched and pushed and kind of came into my own there. I never really felt like I wanted, again, like I never really wanted to make it into anything. Yeah. Like I didn't go there to like, for one thing, the school was unaccredited. So I wasn't like coming back with any type of like real diploma or paperwork or anything with it. So I was never trying to go like unto a job or whatever. It was kind of like, I feel like I need to do this. Yeah. All those kind of transitions in my life, it was like, I felt led.
Like a step by step.
Felt led. And then God would just kind of confirm in like crazy ways, honestly. Yeah. So in my summer in between year 1 and year 2 over there in ministry school in Rhode Island, I felt like a really clear and a really strong direction from the Lord that He wanted me here that he wanted me like at KCC and like and specifically at the time it was like at KCC and to support Pastor Brody.
Yeah.
And which was kind of crazy because at the same time I had this kind of really profound prophetic thing happening where doors were opening to go back for year 2. So what I kind of ended up making it into was like, okay, I'm going to go back for year 2 onto like being equipped and built more and better prepared to be like a service to my church back home in Kelowna. And so I did that. I ended up meeting my wife though.
Big time bonus.
Big time bonus.
You can do that sound.
It's so wild how
Missed it.
it's so wild how that happens and how it's kind of comical, but really amazing, really, really cool, kind of wild story. But even when I got back though, like I came back from year 2, like I was just working.
Yeah,
like,
you
I'm
were
an
just doing
electrician.
electrical?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
just doing electrical and yeah, I just wanted to be a support to the church, and it wasn't for a while actually until Pastor Brian actually had Brian and Natalie had us out for lunch or for dinner and to kind of like express that it was kind of like, I don't know, it was always kind of something he would love to do, like he would hope to be able to do because at the time it was all on his plate.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then a little while later he kind of offered the job, and I was like, first it was kind of scary because you're making a lot more money in the trades than you are in ministry.
Yep.
But it was also like, for me, it also was like, okay, well, you guys are in Kelowna and not Rhode Island because you feel that you're to be here and to be a support to your church and to your leadership. And so like, if this is the step, if like you're able to devote literally your work life to be able to do that, obviously, you should go ahead and do that. So
exactly.
So yeah.
Isn't this what you were looking for?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
So then I joined staff. That was like, I don't know, 3 years ago.
yeah.
It's been 3 years.
3 years have been so
You and I have
fast.
shared an assortment of offices.
Yeah, we've been all over the
We've
place.
been all over the building.
we stacked me, you, and Logan into an office that probably shouldn't have housed 3 of us.
It barely fits one person now in that office.
Just insane.
Yeah.
It's been a journey, but a cool journey.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
really awesome to hear though. I love hearing those stories and how it is really like what Pastor Dave has talked about on how like the puzzle pieces.
So good.
You kind of you take a step and you're like, okay, God, like where are you leading me? Okay, I can kind of see like the next step, and you take it and you're not sure like what's happened. Like you came back and you're doing electrical. You're like, well, okay, like God, what's the next thing? And that's really awesome how he works.
Well, the part about that analogy I love is there's always, like the scripture always outlines the clear things you ought to be doing.
Yeah.
And if you concern yourself with like the clear things you ought to be doing, the outside of the puzzle where it's like, you know, the simple things that we don't talk about enough, like like loving your neighbor and being like building the kingdom and the things that are clearly outlined in the word, you kind of like, if you're focusing on those things and not focusing on like, how do I get to this next step? How do I figure out the middle of the puzzle?
How to become the worship leader of this place?
Yeah.
You know,
I feel like when you don't make it about that stuff and you make it about the simple things, he has this really amazing, beautiful way of like, oh, it becomes clear.
Yeah.
And like you can see, oh, there's a spot for that piece, and you put it in, and it's simple, and you never see the whole thing at once, but
yeah, it makes it so you don't have to guess too. Like you're not guessing, is this the right step? Like, okay, I think this is.
Well, it's really beautiful how when you like, there was some, I don't want to say temptation, but like there was like staying in Rhode Island would have been really, really cool in a lot of ways. Like Rachel and I had built a lot of community there.
Yeah.
Like with leaders that were there, and like we had a ton of opportunity to stay there, be a part of an awesome community, an awesome church.
You have a good relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're in serving already.
Absolutely. Yeah. And honestly probably would have been a little bit almost easier in some ways because you're stepping into this like engine that's like moving.
And you're part of the
part
culture.
of it.
You're part of the culture. You're not like you're not an outsider coming in. You're already and
that culture's already moving. As well. So you're kind of like jumping in the river rather than trying to lead culture where you're like, sometimes if there's parts of culture that are really hard to shift. So like it would have been pretty easy for us to go there, but the thing that's able to keep us like secure and having peace being here, even like during times where like stuff is hard, or it's like sometimes it feels like you're smashing your head against the wall with stuff, and you're like, man, what is going on? Like, why are we here?
Yeah.
Going back to the fact that, like, I know that God has us here. Like, I know that he spoke to us. He spoke a word to us. We had peace, and we followed the peace that he gave us. And so it's like, it's powerful because, like you're saying, the confidence that you get when it's not your thing, it's God's thing, where he's like led you to a place where you know that he has you in the spot where he's got you, then you don't, the pressure's off in a sense, because you're like, well, you have me here. Like, like, what's the next thing I ought to do?
It's like, you brought me here, and like, you're kind of in charge. Like,
literally.
I'm not in charge at all.
It's like Pastor Dave getting stuck in that airport.
Yeah.
Like, well, this is kind of a you problem. Yeah. Because I'm here trying to follow what you asked me to do.
I don't speak Thai. Or whatever the language was.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Like, I did want to kind of get into, thank you for sharing your testimony, but I did want to get into kind of like the meat of, the question, like, why is worship in church? And maybe just why worship is important in general, because I think it's important to talk about, both contexts. There's the context of a Sunday morning, and then there's a context kind of outside in how we live our life. And maybe this is again, this is kind of a bigger question, but can you give like a definition of what worship kind of looks like? Not just in the context of a Sunday morning, because I think a lot of people, when you say worship, or when we talk about worship, or obviously a lot, like if you're raised in the church, you obviously know what that kind of what it looks like on a Sunday morning, and it's really easy to just kind of like pinpoint that this is the only thing that worship is. It's like music on a Sunday morning. We're kind of all singing together the same songs, and it's really easy, especially. For me, like growing up, that's what I viewed worship as. Like, hey, this is what worship is.
Me too.
Music on a Sunday, and that's kind of like where it ends. And it would, the music would end, and we'd be done worshiping. Yeah. But I think that obviously we both know this now, and maybe we could kind of just dive into that idea. Like, what is worship kind of outside the context of just music ministry?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in Romans it talks about presenting yourself as a living sacrifice.
Yeah.
And kind of this idea of like your body, like everything that you do and who you are and where and what you're doing at all times is unto and for the glory of God. And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy I feel like growing up in church almost in a way does that to you. Maybe it's just when you're young because that's how you talk about it. But it's like, oh yeah, it's worship time now.
Yeah.
And like you go and you sing 3 or 4 songs and you're done. But the idea that's presented in Romans is actually more of like, it's that idea of sacrifice harkens back to the Old Testament in Leviticus when there was like a specific set of ways that you ought to do things. Yeah. And so I think it's maybe like easier kind of to compartmentalize.
Totally.
And to be like, okay, it's like church time, it's worship time. Yeah. And then when I leave, it's work time or it's home time or it's hockey time or whatever. But I think God calls us a lot higher than that. And to kind of think about each of like, if you're a different person, depending on your context of like what you're doing, I feel like that's not right. Like, I feel like that's not the way that Christ would have lived. Christ would have been himself, no matter who he was around, no matter if he was like, building a house or in his ministry. Yeah. He was, building his character and becoming like who he was when he started his ministry, but he wasn't like, putting on a different hat, so to speak. And I think maybe a mask is more of like the negative connotation where it's like, okay, like I'm at church now and like it's time for me to raise my hands.
Yeah, put my worship hat on.
Yeah, exactly. But that's like, it also says in the Bible to worship in spirit and in truth. Yeah. And I think that when you're...
John 4:24.
Yeah, right. And the truth side of that is like, if you're not authentic in your worship, whether it's on a Sunday morning during a song, or it's like dealing with your boss on a Monday morning. Yeah. If you're not thinking that way, then I feel like it's tough for God to work. Yeah. God won't come and work if if you're just doing the things
Yeah.
rather than like your heart being in the things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a crazy thought because even in that, like, I feel like, yeah, we're raised. Not that that's the intention.
Isn't that interesting how it kind of frames your mind that way? It frames your mind that way almost like it's obviously unintentional. Like it's not like our parents and our pastors intended for that. It's
Become a robot, you know?
Yeah.
That's not what it is. And so it's more than just singing. It's more than just a part of the service.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I don't want to put everyone in a box, but in most churches, it's a big part of the service. And
right.
I think, what would you say? Maybe you did touch on this a little bit, but like, what would you say like the purpose of worship is? Like we've talked about what is worship, and it's kind of like a lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you live your life. Are you living like with that intention to do everything unto God? Like I'm not just going to work and clocking in 9 to 5. How am I living throughout that day? Like how am I showing Christ in me? If you're an accountant, right? Like how easy would it be to just get yourself in the box of that? But if you're a Christian, you're called to do everything.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of like what we would agree upon. Like you're called to live this life outside of just the context of church.
That's
right?
good.
And so what would be the purpose of, we can go back to like, obviously we as a church value worship.
Mm-hmm.
We've invested money, like we have a person that oversees worship ministry. And what would be the purpose inside the context of church? Like what's the value of worship? Because it's over half the service sometimes, right? And in most churches it is. So.
Yeah. Well, I think like a huge key with worship, and I don't want to dive off or dive away from the question, but I think a huge key to worship is the fact that it's a response. Like worship ought to come from a sense of like, kind of what we were talking about earlier. You can't really like contrive it in a sense. It's like worship ought to be like a response to, not only the good things that God has done for you, but the fact that God deserves praise and he deserves worship before he did anything for us. He created us. He created the universe. He is, the ultimate authority, the ultimate power. On top of that, he's good. Yeah. Which is nice. That's great, right? Mm-hmm. And on top of that, still, he sent his son to die for us. And on top of that, still, individually for you and I, there are all of these ways, countless ways where he's proven himself faithful to us. He's come through for us. He's kept us, maybe not always like safe, but he's been with us through, the times where, hard things happen or difficult situations happen. So I think that in like corporate setting in church, when there's something really, really cool, really powerful about like a group of believers, first of all, it says that where 2 or more are gathered in my name, there I am amongst you. Yeah. And so like before we even start singing, the presence of God is there.
He's already there.
Yeah. And there's something really, really cool, really powerful about like a group of people all recognizing the beautiful, not only just like the beautiful things God has done for them, but like the beauty of God, the glory of God, the majesty of God, and his presence comes. I think something really cool about like corporate worship in church is it's kind of like all of these people aligning themselves in the same way.
That's right.
And God presences himself in those moments among his people, and it does this it has this really cool effect where the stuff in your life kind of just like, it's like a realignment. Yeah. It's a realignment to like, okay, God's big, God's good, God's with me. These big things that are going on in my life really don't,
matter as much.
Yeah, they don't matter as much. They don't really stand, in the way of him, or in, they don't obstruct his plans as hard as they may be. They might be really, really, a lot of people are going through a lot of really difficult things. Yeah. But I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important to have it in church, is because it kind of like sets the stage. It sets the table. It's like a bunch of people come into a room, they align themselves to the same idea, and that idea being that God is supreme, God is glorious, he deserves our praise. And in that, it kind of shifts your heart to like, okay, whatever stuff you've been dealing with during the week, you've kind of like, you realize God presides over all of it.
Yeah, that's so good.
And then your heart has been prepared to hear a word, which is, ideally also kind of being led by the Spirit, and it's in season, and there's ground for it to fall on. And so I think it's kind of those things. I don't know if I answered it in a specific enough way.
No, that's good.
But I think there's a lot of really amazing things that happen when we worship. Like, worship is not the feeling that I get in worship.
Totally. Yeah.
Worship is completely outside of that almost.
Yeah.
Like, it's part of that, but it's completely outside of that. God deserves worship before 12-year-old me felt like fuzzy tingles and goosebumps or whatever during worship. God was worthy of all of my life, all my praise, all of my worship. Yeah. And so, I think that kind of like, it kind of aims us and points us in the same direction.
Yeah.
Ideally.
Well, even you see that all throughout the Bible and the Old Testament, where the worship leaders would be obviously in a different context.
Yeah,
they're going to war.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to war.
We kind of are.
I guess if you want to think about it that way too, but we're not like going to like fight
not
and
physically going to like walk around Jericho.
Yeah. I'm not going to go stab someone with my sword after I sing Jesus Loves Me. Right. Like but obviously the context was like worship was before everything, which is so cool. Because obviously in our situation, say people are battling things.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're walking through struggles, they're walking through obstacles, they're walking through, not that everyone's on the same level of problems,
sure.
But obviously we know that, it's a perpetual thing that we walk through, and we're walking through difficulties. And maybe it's even to our own self, like you were talking about how it's a sacrifice of praise. I'm sacrificing, my will, my wants, my desires. My flesh doesn't want to like sing these songs.
Right.
My flesh doesn't want to get up on a Sunday morning and devote a half an hour of my time or an hour of my time. There's so many. I could be watching, Euro Cup soccer. I could be watching, Stanley Cup or whatever. Like, whatever it is. Like there's that fight in all of us that we're constantly dealing with, and
we're always battling our flesh.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, right. And it is cool that, obviously that's typically why worship is at the center or the forefront of most modern church services. I did have a thought about, the why. Obviously you could strip back all the drums, you could strip back the guitars, you don't need music typically. Like in the purest sense that worship is, you don't need music to have a worship service, right? We would probably agree on that. It might be really awkward, like incredibly awkward. But I heard this actually from Bill Johnson of all people, that they have a purpose for their music, and that it invokes emotion. Do you think, maybe this is like a kind of a both sides of the coin. Do you think that can be, and maybe it kind of goes back to when we were kids and you get the tingly feelings and you get attached to that. Do you think there's like a good and the bad to that? Because obviously like music, when you hear music, you kind of start tapping your feet. Yeah.
It evokes emotion naturally.
Yeah. So like obviously God invented music, and it's not supposed to be a bad thing. It's not supposed to be a thing that's, we should shy away from, but also we have to be really careful with it. So what do you think, like maybe the balance between that? Obviously music's going to invoke emotion, and you could easily get into the side of like just emotionalism and people just making decisions out of, not real, like founded kind of decision making, where it's just like in this kind of whim of feelings or,
right.
How does that play into, the church circle or
I mean, services? I feel like that's kind of a big one. Like, I feel like there's a lot of, in a sense, there's a lot of gray.
Sure.
Because the fact is that music by its nature, like, it evokes emotion. in human beings. And I mean, I think it's really, really awesome. It's beautiful. It's a very cool,
sure.
There's music in heaven. God, throughout the Bible, like, David employed singers and musicians to worship God in the temple. So I don't think, like, I feel like on the one side of things, there's like maybe people who are like super reformed and they're like, it's just all a bunch of emotionalism and drummed up this and whatever. And on the other side, they're over the history of the church and some of like the charismatic movement and some of these things, like there probably was maybe too much of what the reformed people are talking about, where like what really matters and what I think brings it to the center of both of those things, like you can't separate worship, I think, entirely from emotion, or else it's just dead and empty. But what I think brings it back to the center is like it's always, always, always going to be your heart posture. Like where is your heart actually at? Like for you and me on a Sunday morning, it can be really, really easy. Like if I'm not on stage and we're sitting on the front row, it's really easy to be like analyzing all the parts of service. It's almost so impossible hard to just sit in a service and enjoy it.
But that's part of my critical nature as well.
And part of that is fine. But if your heart isn't in a posture before God where you're actually singing the song to Him, rather than just like singing the words and following the melody, but really you're like, oh man, that screen, the color looks off on that screen. Like your heart's not there.
The blue screen of death. Like
which I think is fixed now.
Building.
I think it's fixed now. Oh gosh. But it's always, always the heart posture. I remember this one time, and this is not necessarily like instructive, but it was a huge lesson for me. I remember this one time we had a young adult service happening downstairs. And I came, and I don't remember how many years ago it was. It doesn't matter how old I was. Anyway, we were going through the set that they were, like, I think I got there late, and it was like partway through the song, yada, yada. And it was not great. Like, it was one person on the keys with somebody singing, and it was like...
We won't name names.
No, of course not. Of course not. It was
Ryan Rilkoff.
No, but I remember going down there and thinking like, man, this is tough. Like, there's a part of what we do on Sundays that's like the better. My perspective is the more excellence we can have on stage, the easier, ideally, it is for people to engage and to enter in.
Yeah, sure.
But despite that, you could have like an elite band and like playing everything perfectly, and people could still not be entering in because at the end of the day, it's up to the people. You can't contrive it for them, and you can't change their heart posture by singing the right song or by telling them to lift their hands. So I went downstairs, and it was like a tough listen, and I remember sitting there and thinking like, I should just like, I'm just going to sing the song. I'm just going to close my eyes and try and do my best to enter in. And I felt the Spirit like super intensely. And I feel it was a lesson on purpose. It was like, it doesn't matter what's going on up there.
It's true. Yeah.
To like, of course, I'm a worship pastor. It matters what's going on up
there.
Matters
to Jaman.
It matters what's going on up there. But what really matters is where are you? Like, where's your heart? What's really your heart? Where's your heart sitting? Because it can be a guy playing a guitar out of tune on stage and singing like whatever song, or it can be like Bethel music.
Yeah.
Either of those situations, your heart can be disengaged and you won't get anything out of the service. Either way, on the flip side, you can engage your heart because it's not about that.
Yeah.
The music, the words are all geared to be like aids for you to like, humans need to look at something and to say something and to have words to read sometimes to even just get us to focus on the same thing.
Yeah.
You sit long enough like by yourself in a room and you think about like 4,000 different things in the span of 30 minutes.
Totally.
You need something to read. You need something
easily
to
distracted.
Direct yourself. Easily distracted. Yeah. So that's, I think, what the purpose of the whole, like of the set of the music and of the words is like. Obviously it's, the words are intentional and they're bringing glory, but like whether or not it's like beautiful, sounds great, or doesn't, really doesn't necessarily like shouldn't necessarily stop you from being able to like have an encounter with the Spirit, because it's not actually about that in the first place. It's about you and your heart posture and where you're actually at.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah. That's so important. On in that same vein, you talked about the words that we sing. How important is good theology in music? Because anyone can write a nice song,
right?
Obviously, like you have to have some sort of talent, but music invokes emotion, and you could be singing whatever. And sure, historically, there's probably not been all the best, music or worship songs, and maybe some of the words are kind of odd, or there's been so much contention to that song, "Reckless Love."
Oh, I thought you were gonna go "Sloppy Wet Kiss." There.
"Sloppy Wet Kiss." There was like
Are you sloppy wet guy
I think unforeseen, because sloppy is just it's just the word is just weird for me. But at the same time, that song, "How He Loves,"
so anointed.
Literally, that was the song. I want to say this carefully, because it wasn't the song that saved me, but it is the song that pulled me back into church.
That song was super anointed. It was. That's a very powerful song.
Still to this day,
I'm sloppy wet because the first time the first time I heard that song and it wrecked me, it was sloppy wet. It wasn't unforeseen, and I'm just like stubborn and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah.
It's like, but it's so much less emotional and real. I mean, I think the original story, he wrote that. He didn't write that for church music. He actually wrote it for like he was just writing a song to God because of a really hard season that he was going in, and somebody was like, you need to release that because it's good.
Who was it that kind of made that song famous? The guys with the beards.
Well, Crowder made it famous, but
right.
I'm 99% it was John Mark McMillan that wrote it.
Yeah, that's right. And then when it started to get big, that's when they're like, hey, can we change the lyrics?
Yeah.
Like, this isn't going so well.
Too late. I'm already singing Sloppy Wet every time.
But yeah, like songs like that, and obviously I wasn't thinking about the theology of Sloppy Wet Kiss. When I was singing it, I was just bawling my eyes out, because I was singing about the truth that God loves me. And when I was in a place where I felt unlovable. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And so again, there's a balance. There's a balance to like, okay, well, like, does God come down and give you a sloppy wet kiss? I don't know. Like, is he some like
I think the metaphor was Jesus. Like, the metaphor was Jesus. Yeah. Heaven meets earth was Jesus coming to earth like a sloppy wet kiss. Yeah. It's a force. It's a little bit of a force. Yeah. But like you said
was
too,
that early 2000s? It was kind of okay.
Yeah, it was early 2000s. Yeah. But the incredible, it wasn't just you and me that song impacted. Millions. Back then. It was, went across the whole world. And I think every once in a while there's a song like that. Yeah. Where there's, over the years of the church, there's been a lot of songs like that. Ironically, Reckless Love's probably another one. And that's another one that people had some huge problems with.
God is not reckless. He's calculated.
He knows what he's doing. It's like, well, yeah, he knows what he's doing, but that's not the point of the lyric. The point of the lyric is not he doesn't know what's going on and he's making it up as he goes. The point is like he's fully...
He's like a dog chasing cars. If you've ever watched The Dark Knight, you know the reference.
He's like a dog chasing cars.
How would I know what to do with it when
He's not like that at all, for sure. But he is willing to sacrifice, his everything.
Exactly.
To
that's the point.
To bring you home. And that's the recklessness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny how those two songs in particular are ones that people took huge issue with, and both literally traveled the world and were super impactful to so many people. And obviously, like, people connected with God through those songs.
God can use messy lyrics.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, I mean, I feel like your question was more like, how important are the words? The words obviously are super important, but I feel like sometimes you have this conversation with people about theology and about different things, and it's like, of course, like, you want to study to find yourself approved. Mm-hmm. Of course, you want to believe like as rightly as you kind of have the ability to within yourself, within your means. But I find that like people get so hung up on different theological things, And to be clear, there are theological things that are worth being hung up on.
Yeah.
Like there are core truths that are worth that are worth getting right, and all of it's worth getting right. But nobody has perfect theology.
That's right. Yeah.
So I find like you'll have, I don't want to say arguments. I'll be having arguments with people who are like, well, such and such pastor said this, and like you're really gonna listen to like what he has to say because like because he said this thing, he's a false prophet or like a false teacher or whatever. And it's like, well, man, nobody has perfect theology. So like, if God only spoke to God only spoke to his church using people who had perfect theology, nobody'd be hearing anything because nobody can have it perfectly right.
That's right. Yeah.
And so like, I don't know. I just think there's, of course, like I scrutinize the lyrics of the words like that we sing in church because I think it's really important because honestly, the lyrics of the songs that we sing tend to form people's theology.
Yeah.
Like when you and I were kids and we were listening to like a lot of those songs that were being written was like about the love of God and stuff. Really cool.
Days of Elijah.
I don't know how much
I'm
that
a little bit older than you.
Yeah,
that's a song.
Yeah, I remember that song. I don't
Ryan knows.
I don't remember how much that one formed my theology, but I think that kind of.
What are the days of Elijah? You know what I mean?
Well, I feel like it would have had to been 4,000 years ago when he was here.
Yeah.
Well, days of Elijah, I could see it. No, it's got to be tied to Revelation when there's like when the two prophets are coming back or whatever, and one of them's Elijah, and I forget who the other one is.
Dispensationalist.
Because it's like, behold, he comes riding on the clouds. It's all like Jesus coming backwards.
Yeah.
Okay, we solved it, everyone. We solved it.
Coming back with a tattoo on his leg, like Pastor Brody said.
I looked. Yeah, I don't want to.
We're not going to get into it. We're not going to get into it. That's another episode.
Far.
We'll talk about tattoos.
It's so good.
Oh man.
Anyway,
squirrely.
Lyrics are super important. And you know what's really cool is how, like, I love old songs, like hymns.
Yeah, hymns
have the most powerful lyrics because I feel like it mattered more back then.
That's true.
Back then, especially, I think, like way back then, like way early church hymnal, like the foundational hymns when literally a lot of the lay people couldn't read.
Yeah.
That was literally how they learned about what God was like. And the lyrics evoke that, like they speak that way. So I think like, there's a lot of songs that I wouldn't do on Sunday because of the lyrics, because I just feel like maybe they're not really saying anything.
Sure.
Or there's a lot of songs that are maybe a little bit too much I, me, and not enough kind of like outward.
There's definitely an era of music that was definitely like that, very inward focused, and what you can do for me, God, kind of thing.
Yeah. Like it's almost like the what would you call it? Like who the song is directed to. Sometimes that one hangs me up a lot. It's like, okay, well, who are we singing to? Are we singing to ourselves right now? Because I feel like that's weird. I feel like that's really weird.
I can't worship me. Well, I want to.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I don't know how well of an answer that.
Well, yeah, no, it's good. It's a balance. Again, it's a balance to it's a tension.
Yeah,
we're talking about the tension.
Truth is always intention.
Like there's a tension to it. If you look so deeply into music and songs and lyrics, you're going to find issues. But then you're just going to become this person who you can't enter in because that's all you're going to be thinking about is the issues.
And
all you're going to be thinking about is the wrong notes, and all you're going to be thinking about is, that person's playing too loud, or that, that word is, this actually means this.
Well, it does come back to the heart again with that. It's like you can sing a lyric in a song that's like, well, if you really scrutinize over this, it's like, is that exactly the proper hermeneutic of the text? It's like, well, and I don't want to be too dismissive of that.
No.
Because I genuinely do think it's really important, but it does come back to the heart.
Yeah.
If you're singing Reckless Love and you're thinking like, you're getting a revelation of the love of God for you because you feel like the prodigal son who was not worthy of being accepted by his father again.
Yeah.
And that connects you to the heart of God. Like that's amazing. That's beautiful. And I think it goes a little bit too far sometimes.
Sure.
But again, it's tension because you don't want to I don't also think you should just be singing everything, like anything up there.
You want to be careful.
Yeah.
And too, it's like, it's like anything. You just got to be careful and have wisdom, and
you have to discern.
And God can use a donkey.
Yeah, absolutely.
God will use a rock or a tree, and he has, right? And so you have to be careful. We are not perfect people. So we talked a lot about, corporate worship and the importance of worship inside the context of service, Sunday morning. What is, I guess, the other side of it? What's the other side of that coin? What does private worship look like? Because there's corporate worship and there's private worship, and you talk about the heart, and obviously you have to have some degree of worship outside the context of church to come to church and be ready to worship, because if there's only that, again, you get caught in that loop of just, singing songs and not really, your heart's not in it. So how does a person, develop that private kind of worship lifestyle? Maybe it's a broad question. I don't know if you wanted to tackle a little bit about that, maybe even just from personal experience.
Yeah, I feel like for like the worship leader, maybe I'll start there. For like the worship leader, I feel like you can kind of tell when somebody's like been some places in their private, in their like in their prayer closet with God, and usually like those people that kind of come off like anointed or whatever. Yeah. It's because they have like they've had those deep moments, those deep connections with God. And, I remember in school, Pastor Josh talking about like, Corey Asbury didn't just wake up and like have a sick voice. And, it's like God he has a whole journey of like, between literally working on his craft and being a really good, like an awesome vocalist. Yeah. But also, having those deep, intimate moments with God. So, but that can definitely look different for different people. Sure. Like, I mean, for me, I'm probably as simple as a lot of people as just like when I'm in the car and I'm putting on worship music and I'm just like singing and allowing for that space to be with God and me. Or maybe like home alone, prepping dinner before Rachel gets home, or, on and on. I think it's tied to prayer. Like Pastor Dave talked about in our last episode, like, how do you pray without ceasing? That's impossible unless you're just listening all the time, because prayer should really be mostly listening rather than just like complaining and asking for things. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a part of it too. It's like when you're like in your day to day, you don't have to necessarily be like singing or like singing on key or whatever. But yeah, I think in your private time and in like your devotions, where God and his presence and his voice will often like come to speak to you. Those are some of the times I think where he like, I don't know, those are like the meaningful ones. Yeah. Like those are the ones where it's like almost the ones that are just for you and him, where I feel like, where it's, I don't know, I feel like there's a little more like meaning there, where it's not like this moment on stage with lights on and sound and on and on. Like those moments are great too. But yeah, I think that it's got to be intentional with you. Like, again, you can have worship music on in the car and be singing along to it. But if your mind's not there and your heart's in like a different place and you're thinking about like, how am I going to pay these bills, or like, what are we having for dinner tonight? Yeah. Then like your posture's not there. Like your heart posture's not actually directed to him. I think when we sing songs, it's really easy to just sing songs. It's really easy to just sing words. Yeah. But when you are intentional about like you're singing the words Amazing Grace, like, and you think about the fact that like literally you are a wretch that was not worth being saved. Yeah. And God sent his son in that ultimate sacrifice to save you, to save your soul, and to give you like so much more than you deserve. Yeah. Then that song becomes one of the most powerful songs that's ever been written by human hands. Yeah. It's like, it's incredible. Or it's just a song that's backtracking a movie soundtrack. Yeah. And it doesn't mean anything to you. But it all depends on like on where you're at. It depends on your heart posture and like actually considering like, wow, God, you're good and you're faithful and you've given me so much more than I deserve. And that's when you connect with that.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful thought. And that really does answer my last question I had, which is so cool because, I think a lot of people do struggle. Maybe not a lot of people, but I would say again, kind of even just in our generation, like kind of struggling to actually connect with God outside of church. I think that's a lot of people. It's almost like church is, I want to say this carefully, not a crutch, but it kind of becomes that, where it's like, this is where I get my God time. This is where, and what you're saying is it's so good, because it is an intentional push to put on worship music, or an intentional like mindset shift
to engage with it.
Yeah, because we are so, we're so caught up in worldly things all the time. Like and it's not necessarily like a bad thing. It's like we have responsibilities. People have kids, they have financial struggles, they have, all these things piling on in their life, and it's so easy just to like go to those places. Okay, what's the next problem I have to solve?
Yeah.
Instead of changing it to a place where it's like, I'm just like, I want to live a life of worship. Okay, it means putting God first. Okay, God first before those things. And
setting your eyes on Him.
Yeah, not that I forget all my responsibilities. God's going to take care of it. I'm just going to sit on the couch and worship. Right? Yeah. That's not what we're talking about. It's like, as you walk out those things, is really the question is like, am I putting God first?
Right. Absolutely.
And that comes back to that puzzle, right?
Yeah.
The known will of God. And I get reminded of, seek first the kingdom,
all these,
and all the little puzzle pieces in the middle, all these little, like, these questions that you might have. What is my purpose, and what am I supposed to do, and what does my future look like, and how am I going to pay these bills, and how am I going to get into the housing market, and how am I going to get to this job, and how am I going to make an influence? And those are good intentions, right? But again, like, if you seek first the known will of God, and you seek first like what He has, all those little pieces start to fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that works in our worship.
Absolutely. Yeah, huge verse for me growing up was that Matthew 6. Is it 36? 6:30 something.
Somebody look that up.
But seek first the kingdom, and all these will be added unto you. That was like a verse for me that, like, I mean, it wasn't like I read the verse and like, oh, never stressed out about what God has for me again.
Yeah.
But it was like the thing I had to always come back to.
Yeah.
I feel like it's such a powerful lesson that gets you to a place where it's like, okay, I'm seeking Him. My eyes are on Him. I'm working on the outside of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And it helps you to kind of just release that other stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, it's obviously, it's hard work to release that other stuff, but so necessary.
Yeah.
And then it's just really beautiful how it becomes God's thing anyways.
Yeah.
It's less your thing when you live like that.
Mm-hmm. And that's the way we're supposed to live.
Absolutely.
A living sacrifice. Absolutely. And I love that you brought that up.
Yeah.
Well, hey, thank you for being on the podcast, Jaman.
It was great.
This was really fun.
It's crazy being on this side of the cameras.
Yeah. I think it should be a normal thing. We should get more of the producers in this side. Maybe next Ryan. Hey, Ryan back here. No, cool. But seriously, thank you for being on the podcast, sharing your heart, sharing even just your testimony. I think, we just need more of that. I think it's so practical what you had to say today. And so thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Of course. Until next time, like and share this video. If you're watching on YouTube, like and share it. Subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on any episodes. We're going to be pumping some episodes out this summer. Super excited for that. We hope you enjoyed today's topic. And, share this with somebody. If you're listening on Apple, Spotify, text this podcast to somebody. If maybe even someone just, thinking about the topic that we're talking about today, or maybe they're a person that has struggled with getting into that private worship life. This episode and this podcast is really, we just want to equip and resource people and encourage people. So we hope that was that for you today. We'll see you next time on the mezzanine floor.